The car stopped on its own, or so it felt, the moment the smooth highway gave way to broken stone. Edward Vance had driven 6 hours north to a town he had spent 30 years pretending he had never come from. The rain had just quit, and the air through the cracked window smelled of wet iron and wood smoke, and something faintly sweet he could not name. He owned 40 floors of glass in a city that had never heard of this place. He had sat across the table from men who moved whole markets with a single phone call, and he liked to say that in 30 years he had never once been wrong about a person. And yet here he sat, both hands on the wheel of a car worth more than every house on this street put together, unable to make himself drive the last 200 yards, because at the end of the broken street stood a low brick building with one warm light burning in its single unboarded window, and from inside it, carried thin and clear across the cold evening air, came a sound he had not braced himself for. Children, laughing. He had come back to sign 3 papers, sell the old plant, and never set foot here again. He had not come back to find her. The last time Edward Vance had stood in front of the woman who was somewhere inside that building, he had looked straight through her and told her to get out of his sight. He had been so certain. He had been so completely, immovably certain. What he was about to learn, about her, about himself, about the 2 years he had spent being right, would not fit inside any contract he had ever signed his name to. He turned the engine off. The laughing went on without him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Edward Vance had no idea what to do next. To understand the man frozen in that car, he would have to understand what he had spent his entire life running from. Edward had been born 4 streets from where he now sat, in a house with a tin roof that sang when it rained and leaked when it poured. His father had worked the line at the same plant Edward would one day own, and had died owing money to men who came to the door on the first of every month. Edward left at 17, with 1 suitcase and a single, hardening promise that he would never again be the boy whose shoes let the water in. He kept that promise. He kept it the way some men keep a wound. By 58, he had built Vance Industrial out of nothing into something with his name carved over the doors of 3 cities. From the 44th floor of his headquarters, the whole skyline lay beneath him like a thing he had earned. He arrived first and left last. He trusted numbers, because numbers had never once looked down on him. And he trusted the men who brought him numbers, which was in the end the door through which everything wrong would walk. His flaw was not cruelty. It was pride. The particular pride of a man who has clawed his way out of poverty and decided, somewhere along the way, that he therefore understands it, that because he escaped, anyone honest could escape, and anyone who stayed behind had simply chosen to stay. It let him sleep at night. It let him never look back. It let him drive past the exit for his own hometown 100 times without slowing down. He was back now only because the old plant had finally stopped earning. The board had voted to close it, strip it, and sell the land. There were papers that needed a signature in person, and a manager named Dale Renner, who had run the place for 19 years and wanted, he said on the phone, to thank Mr. Vance properly before the doors came down for good. Edward had planned to be in and out in a single afternoon. He had not planned to drive to the edge of Mill Road at dusk. He had not planned any of what was coming. But to understand why he could not move, you have to go back 2 years, to the only other morning Edward Vance had ever set foot in that plant. It had been winter, and he had been in a hurry. He remembered the cold of the loading dock, the kind that gets into the teeth. He remembered Renner walking beside him, talking fast, a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. There had been a shrinkage problem at the plant, inventory walking off the books, month after month, always traced to the same overnight shift. Renner had built a case, security footage of a cleaner carrying flattened cardboard boxes out the side door night after night. Logs showing antiseptic, gauze, soap, and bandages missing from the supply room on her watch. Co-workers, 3 of them, all on Renner's crew, who would swear they had seen her loading her car. And there she stood at the center of the dock, in the gray light, a woman of perhaps 50 with her hair pulled back and her hands folded in front of her. Helen Carter. Her name meant nothing to him then. She had worked there 11 years. She did not look frightened. That was the thing he would remember later, when remembering had become a kind of punishment. She did not look frightened. And she did not look guilty. She looked like someone waiting for a man to finish making a mistake. The whole night crew had been kept on past their shift to witness it. That had been Renner's idea, though Edward did not know it then. Humiliation, to do its work, needs an audience. 11 years, Renner said, loud enough for the back of the dock to hear, and this is how she repays you, Mr. Vance, caught on camera. Caught on the logs. People like her always have a sad story ready, but the cameras don't lie. Edward looked at the footage on the clipboard. He looked at the woman. He thought of the boy whose shoes let the water in, and of every excuse that boy's father had made to the men at the door. And a cold contempt rose in him that had nothing to do with Helen Carter at all. "Do you have anything to say?" he asked her. He has asked himself 1,000 times since why he hoped she would beg. He thinks now it was because begging would have made her smaller than him. And smaller than him was a thing he understood how to forgive. She did not beg. Helen Carter raised her eyes and held his, and she did not raise her voice. The dock went quiet around her. When she spoke, every man on that crew leaned in without meaning to, the way you lean toward a low flame on a dark night. "I won't tell you I didn't carry those boxes out, Mr. Vance," she said. "I did. Every one of them. And I'll let you think whatever you need to think about that, because I can see your mind is already made up, and a made-up mind doesn't have room for the truth." She paused, and her hands stayed folded, and somehow that stillness was louder than any shout. "But I'll say one thing, and then I'll go. You counted every box that left this place. You never once asked what they became." For a moment, one single moment, something in Edward's chest moved, like a door swinging on a hinge it hadn't used in years. Then Renner said, "Security, walk her out." And the moment closed, and Edward let it. "You're done here," he told her, and he turned away before she had finished gathering her coat, because that was easier than watching, and because he had a flight to catch, and because he was certain. He told himself the whole drive back to the airport that he was certain. He was good at telling himself things. He did not see her stop at the gate and press her hand flat against the cold metal post for the space of a breath, the way a person steadies herself before stepping into deep water. He did not see Walter, the old foreman who had worked that plant for 40 years, watch her go with his jaw tight and his eyes wet and his mouth, God forgive him, he would say later, shut. He did not see any of it. He was already gone. 2 years, 2 winters, and in all that time, the woman at the loading dock crossed his mind exactly once, on a sleepless night in a hotel in another country, when a janitor passed his door humming, and Edward sat up in the dark with a sentence ringing in his ears that he could not remember hearing. "You never once asked what they became." Now he was back, and the laughing would not stop, and he could not drive away. He drove instead to the diner on the corner of Main, the only place still lit, because he needed a moment to gather himself, and because something in him was not ready to go home to the empty motel and lie still with that sound in his head. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 70, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair, and a name stitched on her apron, Ruth. She poured his coffee without being asked, and studied his face the way people in small towns study a stranger who is not quite a stranger. "You're the Vance boy," she said. Not a question. "Come to bury the plant." He didn't deny it. Ruth set the pot down. "There's a woman," he heard himself say, surprising himself, "who used to work the plant. Carter. Helen Carter. She moved on, I assume. Left town." The old woman looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt it in his collar. "Left town," Ruth repeated softly, and something in her voice could have stripped paint. "No, son. Helen Carter never left this town a single day in her life. She's out at the end of Mill Road. Been there 2 years now, since the morning she stopped getting a paycheck." She picked the pot back up. "You really didn't know?" It was not a question either. He should have driven to the motel. Instead, he drove to Mill Road, and that is where the road ran out under his wheels, and that is where this all began. He got out of the car. He had not walked a street like this in 40 years, and his body remembered it before his mind did. The way the broken pavement tipped underfoot, the way the cold came up through the soles of shoes that had cost more than a month of his father's wages. The streetlights here were spaced too far apart to do much good. Between them, the dark pooled thick. It was the kind of neighborhood the map in his car didn't bother to name, where the houses leaned together for warmth like old men at a bus stop, where every roofline wore the specific, patient exhaustion of a structure that had been holding itself together through sheer stubbornness for longer than anyone could remember. His coat was wrong here. His watch was wrong. His whole bearing was wrong, and he felt it with every step. And some buried, honest part of him understood that this was the first true thing he had felt in 2 years. He walked the length of that street slowly, and the further he went, the more the town stripped away its few pretenses. The houses here did not pretend. A porch held up by a stack of cinder blocks. A car on the lawn that had not moved in years, its windows gone soft and white with age. A child's bicycle, rusted to the color of old blood, chained to a railing as though anyone would want to steal it. He passed a man on a step who watched him pass with the flat, unsurprised look of someone who had learned a long time ago that men in coats like Edward's never came to this street to give, only to take, to repossess, to evict, to measure. Edward met the man's eyes and looked away first, and the small shame of that, the losing of a contest he had not known he was in, told him something about who held the dignity on this street and who did not. That is what pride does, in the end. It builds a man a tower so tall he can no longer make out the faces of the people he climbed past on the way up. And then it convinces him the faces were never worth the looking. It had taken Edward Vance 30 years and 40 floors to climb out of a street exactly like this one. It would take him 200 yards of broken pavement to begin the long way down. The low brick building had been a schoolhouse once. He could see the ghost of letters above the door where a sign had been pried away. Most of the windows were boarded with mismatched wood, but the boards were new. And the door had a heavy lock on it, bright and clean, the single most expensive thing on the entire street. A lock that said plainly that whatever was inside was worth protecting more than any of the people protecting it could easily afford. He should have knocked. He knew even then that the decent thing was to knock. But Edward Vance had spent 2 years being certain, and a part of him needed to see before he was seen. Needed, just once more, the small, ugly power of watching without being watched. So he went to the side, to the one window where a board had warped and pulled free of its nail, and he leaned to the gap, and he looked in. And before he could make sense of anything his eyes found, the sound reached him first. It always does. It reaches the old and the proud before the picture ever can, because sound goes straight to the place where memory lives without asking permission. A child's voice, small and bright and certain. From somewhere in the warm room, Miss Helen. You're home. Then another, younger. Tell us the candle one. Tell us the candle one tonight. And then her voice. Helen Carter's voice, but not the voice from the loading dock. Not the flat, steady voice of a woman waiting out a powerful man's mistake. This voice was soft and full and bent with tenderness. The voice a person only ever uses for those they would lay their life down for, without a second's thought. All right. All right. Let me see to Emma first, and then the candle one. Come here, little bird. Let me feel that forehead. Edward's eyes adjusted, and the room assembled itself out of the lamplight, and what he saw took the strength out of his knees. Beds, a dozen small, neat beds, lined in 2 careful rows along the walls of what had once been a classroom. And the beds were made of cardboard, flattened boxes folded, and fitted, and bound, and layered into low frames, the seams reinforced, and the edges worn smooth by hands that had clearly built and rebuilt them many times until they were sturdy enough to trust a sleeping child to. The Vance industrial stamp was still faintly visible on one of them, near the floor, where no one had bothered to hide it. The boxes she had carried out every night for 11 years, the boxes he had fired her for, they had become beds. In the corner, on a shelf, stood the rest of it, arranged like something sacred. The antiseptic, the gauze, the bandages, the bars of soap. Not sold, not hidden. Used, a roll of gauze sat half spent beside a basin, and kneeling at the nearest bed was Helen, 2 years older and thinner than he remembered, pressing a cloth damp with the plant's own antiseptic to the burning forehead of a little girl of maybe 6, smoothing it the way you smooth something you are terrified of losing. There were others, older children moving quietly through the warm room, each with a task, each with the unhurried competence of children who have learned that the household will not run itself. The oldest girl, perhaps 12, folded blankets in a stack at the foot of each bed with a gravity far beyond her years. She had the face of a person who had stopped waiting to be rescued and decided to do the rescuing herself. A boy of 9 or 10 fed the small stove one careful piece of wood at a time, rationing it the way only the poor ever learn to ration warmth. On the wall above them, taped at a child's height, hung a single photograph curling at its corners. A man in a hard hat, smiling, his arm around a much younger version of the girl folding blankets. Edward did not need to be told who he was. He had read the man's name that very week, without knowing it, in a falsified logbook he would not open until morning. But Edward's eyes were locked on the woman and the sick child, and through the gap in the boards he heard the little girl speak, and the words went into him like cold water into a man who has been asleep. Miss Helen, the child whispered, her eyes half closed, her small hand finding Helen's wrist. When my daddy looks down from heaven, can he see that I'm warm now? The room went still. Even the boy at the stove stopped. And Helen Carter, who had not begged on the loading dock, who had stood straight while a rich man called her a thief in front of 40 witnesses, bent her head close to the girl and said, in a voice that did not shake, because she had long ago decided it would not shake in front of these children, he can see. Emma, your daddy can see everything. He sees that you're warm, and he sees that you're loved, and he knows for certain that you are not alone. Outside, in the dark, Edward Vance stopped being able to stand. He did not decide to step back from the window. His body simply did it, retreating from the gap as though from a furnace. He made it as far as the broken curb, and there his legs folded under him, and he sat down hard in the cold mud in a coat that cost more than the lock on that door. His hands had begun to shake. He pressed them flat against the wet ground as if he could borrow some steadiness from the earth, and he could not. He got himself, somehow, back to the car. He got the door open, and he fell into the seat. He reached for the ignition, and his fingers would not close on the key. They trembled too badly. They would not obey him. And after the third try he gave up, and leaned his forehead against the cold rim of the steering wheel, and stayed there, a powerful man bent double in the dark, over a sound he could not unhear. When my daddy looks down from heaven, Daddy, the girl's father, a worker, dead, and the company that had owned his life had been so busy counting boxes that it had never once asked what those boxes became, or who the woman carrying them out at midnight was carrying them for. Edward did not sleep that night. He sat in the car until the cold drove him to the motel, and then he sat on the edge of a strange bed until the window went gray. And somewhere in those long hours, the certainty he had carried for 30 years finally, quietly, broke. And through the crack in it came the rest of the truth. The part that would put a man in prison if there were any justice left in this world. He found it the next morning, and he found it where he should have looked 2 years before, in the ledgers. He went to the plant at dawn, before Renner arrived, and he found old Walter, the foreman, sweeping a floor that was about to be torn up anyway, and he asked him a single question. Walter, the shrinkage. 2 years ago. Was it her? Walter leaned on his broom. 40 years he had worked that plant. He was an old man with a young man's grief still in his eyes, and when he finally spoke it was one sentence, the one true sentence he had been too afraid to say on the loading dock 2 winters before, and saying it now seemed to take something off his shoulders that he had carried far too long. It was never her, Mr. Vance. It was him. And we all knew. And we were all afraid for our jobs. And we let a good woman walk out that gate so the rest of us could keep ours. God forgive us. God forgive me. Then Walter went to the back office, and he came out with a second set of ledgers, the real ones, the ones he had quietly copied and kept for 2 years, not knowing if anyone would ever come who cared enough to read them, because the numbers Renner showed Edward had been the lie. The true numbers showed the rest. 19 years of inventory siphoned off and sold by Dale Renner himself, the theft buried under a cleaner's nightly cardboard. And worse, far worse, buried among the falsified safety logs, was the report of an accident on the line 3 winters ago. A guardrail Renner had been told to replace and never had, to save against his budget. A man crushed in the night shift. A man named Thomas Hale, who left 3 children and a wife who would die of grief and illness within the year. Renner had covered it. Renner had paid off no one and reported nothing. And when a cleaner named Helen Carter had begun, quietly, to ask questions about how Thomas Hale had died, and to take home the boxes and bandages so his orphaned children would not freeze, Renner had built his little case and handed it to a proud man in a hurry, and the proud man had done the rest. Edward was still holding the ledgers when Renner walked into the yard at 8, smiling, hand extended, ready to thank Mr. Vance properly. The whole day crew was there, the same yard, the same gray light. Edward made sure of it. He gathered them, every one, in the place where Helen had been made to stand, because justice that is not witnessed in the same place as the injustice is not justice at all. It is only paperwork. He did not shout. He had learned, in one night, that the quietest voice in the room is the one that cannot be argued with. Dale Renner, he said, holding up the ledger so the crew could see, you stole from this company for 19 years. You let Thomas Hale die over a guardrail you were too cheap to fix, and you buried him in a logbook. And then you framed an innocent woman to cover all of it. And his voice caught, and he let it, in front of all of them. I was fool enough and proud enough to help you do it. You're done here. Not fired. Done. The men coming up that drive behind you are not from this company. Renner's mouth worked. He reached, as men like him always do, for the performance, for the sad story, for the indignation, for the audience he imagined was on his side. He found none. He found 40 silent faces who had known the truth for 2 years and had finally been given a man with the power to say it out loud. They watched him taken from the yard in the same place they had watched Helen taken from it. And old Walter stood at the edge of the crowd and let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding since the winter he stayed quiet. And for the first time in 2 years, the old foreman's shoulders came down from around his ears. Edward drove out to Mill Road that afternoon. This time, he knocked. She opened the door with the sick child on her hip, the fever broken now, Emma's color back, and she looked at him without surprise, and without fear, and without warmth, the way you look at weather you have lived through before. Behind her, the beds of cardboard stood in their 2 neat rows in the daylight. "I'm not here to ask your forgiveness," Edward said, and his voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it so. A man who counts boxes for a living shouldn't dare ask for something he never earned. "I'm here to make you an offer, and I need you to hear all of it before you say no," he told her then, standing on the broken step with his expensive shoes in the mud. The plant would not be torn down. The board had voted to strip it for scrap. He would buy them out himself by Friday, and they could have their numbers and their silence both. It would be rebuilt as a foundation, a real one, with a charter and a bank account and lawyers. His name signed beneath hers on the founding document, and not one line above it. It would be called the Thomas Hale Foundation, after the man who had died for a guardrail, and a new wing of the old plant would carry a different name still, the Hale Safety Standard, a set of rules written so that no foreman anywhere in the company could ever again choose a budget over a man's life and bury him in a logbook. The foundation would fund the medical care, the housing, and the schooling of every child orphaned or injured by that plant, and the 100 plants like it across 3 cities, beginning with the children sleeping 40 feet from where they now stood. Lucy would go to university one day, every cent paid, and so would Sam, and so would Emma. And Helen Carter would not be the foundation's charity case, to be thanked at galas and forgotten by morning. She would be its director, with a contract, a salary, an office, and the final word on every dollar it spent. Because in 2 years on a cleaner's wage, with nothing but flattened cardboard and a shelf of bandages he had once called theft, she had already built with her own 2 hands the very thing he was only now, at 58 and 40 floors up, rich enough to imagine. Helen was quiet for a long moment, the same stillness from the loading dock. Then she shifted the child on her hip and stepped back from the door to let him in, which was its own kind of answer. They held the first dinner a week later, in the long room with the beds, at a table made of 2 old doors laid across crates and covered with a cloth Ruth had brought from the diner. Walter came in a clean shirt, with his hair combed flat, and he sat among the children and let the smallest of them climb into his lap. And the old foreman, who had stayed silent for 2 winters, laughed out loud at something a 6-year-old said, a rusty sound he seemed surprised to still own. Ruth brought 3 pies and refused all help, and ruled the makeshift kitchen like a queen. The children ate until they could not move. There were men there, too, fathers and uncles from the street, men who had watched Edward pass with flat, unsurprised eyes a week before, and now passed him the bread without ceremony. Because a table, it turns out, can do in one evening what a courtroom cannot do in a year. The oldest girl, Lucy, who had folded blankets like a soldier, fell asleep at last against Helen's shoulder, with the loose, total trust of a child who has finally been allowed to be a child again. On the windowsill, someone had lit a single candle for Thomas Hale, and as they sat there, the rich man and the cleaner and the orphans and the old foreman who had finally spoken. The door at the far end, which no one had touched, drifted open on the evening air, and a soft, warm draft moved through the room and bent the small candle flame low. It leaned almost to the sill. Everyone went quiet, watching, the way people do. And then it stood back up, steady and bright, and it did not go out. Lucy stirred and murmured, "Half asleep, that's my dad saying hi," and went back to sleep, and Helen smoothed the girl's hair and did not correct her, because some things a child says are truer than anything an adult could prove. If you have ever carried something out of a place where no one thanked you for it, if you have ever been judged by people who never once asked what your hands were really for, then you already know the woman in that room, because you have been her, or you have failed to see her, and most of us in this life have managed, at one time or another, to be both. Because in the end, a man is not measured by what he can count leaving his door, but by whether he ever found the humility to ask what those same quiet hands were building, in the dark, in a place he was always too proud to look.